Thank you, Sheila. So, as Sheila mentioned, I'm here today because I teach a class, and I actually co-teach this class with another professor from the biology department, Dr. Rick Hochberg. And so the class that we're teaching is called Biology and Evolution of the Arthropods. And arthropods are they're this massive group of organisms that includes things like the insects, spiders, crustaceans, which includes things like lobsters and crabs that you're familiar with, and centipedes and millipedes. And so we cover this big group, but a very interesting thing about this group is that there are numerous arthropods that have evolved the ability to produce silk. And that includes the silk that you're familiar with, the commercial silk that we make textiles from. And so, Sheila was saying, we wanted to incorporate into our class what's called a service learning component. And so service learning is basically an interactive form of learning, which is also community-based. So the idea is that the students in the class take the knowledge that they've learned in the classroom and basically inform some community partner about what they've learned. And hopefully there can be some kind of shared interactive learning through the process. And so because of this sort of shared interest in fibers and textiles, we decided that one of our service learning activities would be targeted towards the community partners in Lowell that focus on this textile history. And I was fortunate to meet Sheila, and we came up with this idea of having 4 members of the class create a presentation which is about Arthropod Silks for the staff of the Tsongas Industrial History Center. And really the purpose is just to tell you about the neat things that the students have learned, and you know, potentially if there's anything interesting that you learn from us, you might also incorporate it into some of your educational materials. So really the action was yesterday, and what I mean by that is that we had the 4 students, which included Sandra Correa, who kindly came back to assist me today, and there was also Ben Nguyen, Andrew Danko, and Stacy Lindmark. And so they couldn't do the presentation twice, so I basically agreed to come back and re-present their presentation for them. So anyway, on to the arthropod silks. So what is silk? Essentially, silk is a kind of fibrous material that's secreted by an animal. Okay? So as I said, most of you are familiar with commercial silk, and that's created by the larvae of a moth. Okay? So here's the moth, and this is the moth emerging from a cocoon that the larval stage of that animal made. So we see over here a whole bunch of these silk cocoons, and those cocoons are transformed into silk fibers, which are woven into silk textiles. But what's really remarkable is that there are many other kinds of organisms that also have the capacity to produce silk. So all of these organisms that make silk are within this group called arthropods, and there's been multiple evolutions of silk production within arthropods. So for example, we know that spiders make silk, and there's also the silkworms that I just told you about that make silk. So they're insects, which is in this group called Hexapoda. But actually, silk production has independently evolved 23 different times within hexapods. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. So the silk is made in insects and other organisms inside of glands. So silk glands in these different insects can be associated with their mouth parts, so labial glands. They can also have glands associated with their tarsi, which are their hands. And they can also have glands which are in their abdomen, which are basically transformed excretory organs. And generally speaking, from the animal's view, the purpose of using silk is almost always for reproduction or development. Okay, so I'm going to show you some different examples of insect silk to start off with. Now this is caddisflies, and caddisflies, here's the adult caddisfly. And this is a group of organisms that are very closely related to the Lepidoptera, which include moths and butterflies. So you can see the adult form. It looks somewhat like a moth, and the larvae are completely aquatic. So we see the larvae over here, and it uses silk to build a larval case. So what it does is it has, just like moths and butterflies, the larvae can make silk from the labial glands. Okay, so from their mouth parts, they secrete silk, and they use the fibers to basically wrap up the cocoon that's made from particles in its environment. So it depends on the species of caddisfly and where it lives. So sometimes you find them in streams where you have a lot of little wood particles, and they make a case that looks like this, so it's all sewn together with a silk fiber. And sometimes they're in streams where you have pebbles, and they make this pebbly case. And then there's even some interesting species that take it further, and they make an extension of their case as a net. So you see here, there's essentially a net that's been woven with the silk that it produces. And an interesting little factoid about this group is that people have exploited their interesting behavior by collecting the larvae from the wild and placing them into aquaria that are lined with precious stones and gems and so on. And so what these guys do is they spin their case instead using silk to put together different kinds of stones. And then people remove them and turn them into earrings and necklaces and whatnot. So very attractive here. So those are caddisfly larvae. A second interesting example I'll tell you about are glowworm larvae. So this glowworm is the larvae of a particular kind of fly. And the species in this group are distributed in New Zealand and Australia. And so the larvae of the fly, it's kind of actually this hideous thing that crawls up. It lives in caves, and it crawls up to the top of the cave. And what it does two things that are absolutely amazing. One thing it does is it makes silk, and it makes a kind of net or web with the silk. And the net is essentially these number of threads that it hangs down, and it has these little sort of aqueous globules that are on top of it like a glue. Okay, so that's number one amazing thing that this fly larvae does. So it's this worm thing that makes about 17 strands like this. The second amazing thing that it does, it has the capacity for bioluminescence. So inside of its body, it drives this reaction to create a glow with an enzyme. And so the glow essentially attracts other kinds of things like insects towards the web. And then they're intercepted by the strands, and they reel them up and eat them. So it's this really amazing example of using silk for interesting predatory technique. And they're also quite an important tourist attraction in New Zealand. So the caves are very beautiful to look at because they look like these sort of starry nights. Okay, another example are the web spinners. So this is another order of insects that is a silk producer, and it's interesting because unlike those other examples I told you about, it makes silk from its hands. Okay, so it has these what we call tarsi, which are the most distal part of the leg is enlarged, and it's filled with all kinds of tiny silk glands, and it goes about patting down the silk that extrudes from these tarsi, and it builds up silk gallery like this, galleries. And so they live inside of these silk galleries, and they line trees, and they can be found on the ground and so on. So they're very little tiny guys, but you can notice them when you see these sort of silk galleries on tree trunks. Okay, so here's another interesting example. Some kinds of crickets can also make silk. So these are just particular species of crickets, and they also make silk with labial glands. And what they do that principally for is to create certain kinds of retreats that they hang out in. So here's an example of a retreat created by this cricket, and you see here it's essentially two parts of a leaf that have been cut open, and then they're sort of sewn up with some silk there. And you can see the silk fibers themselves magnified. So I have a little video of this, and hopefully it will work. It's been a little bit sensitive. Okay, so here is actually the cricket has been introduced to a plastic tube, and it's a little slow for some reason.
Did it turn itself to pause maybe?
Possibly. There we go. Okay. So it's a little bit hard to see with the light, but you may be able to see. Oh, I think it's the computer actually is slow. I'll just narrate. So the cricket is basically going back and forth with its mouth parts, and they're very hard to see here, but there are these little fibers going across here that it creates. I think the safest thing to do would be oh, there we go. So you can kind of see the fibers a little bit better here. I think we should move on. Okay.
Speed it up or
it's a good question. I think it could be speeded up, but I'm not 100% certain about this. Okay, so I'm moving on. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about some ants that make silk. So not all ants make silk, but some of them do. These are weaver ants, and these are green weaver ants, which are found in Australia. And they do a really fascinating thing. So they make nests, which are basically composed of leaves in their environment, and they bend them around, and they create the nest by sort of suturing them up with silk. Now, the adults themselves can't make the silk, but what they do is they take their own larvae, and the larvae can make silk, and they essentially manipulate the larvae and squeeze them with their jaws and push them up to the leaves to create the silk fibers. So that's a pretty fascinating behavior. Okay, so I've told you about just some examples of different kinds of insect silk. So as I told you, there's 23 evolutionary events in which silk has been produced. So I can't go through all of them. Now I want to move on and tell you about spider silk. And one of the take-home messages should be of this talk is that spiders are the silk masters. So of the insects I showed you, the thing about them is most of them are producing silk for a limited period of their life, and it's usually just for one purpose. So classic example of this is Bombyx mori, which is a silkworm silk. It's making the silk to make its pupal case, and it does it as a larvae. So only the larvae makes the silk, and it's strictly for the purpose of development. Now spiders are very different in that they use silk throughout their lifetimes. From the moment they're born until they die, they're using silk. And the other thing that's really remarkable about spiders is the many different types of silks that they've evolved. So as I'm going to elaborate on in a few minutes, there are certain spider species that can make as many as 7 different kinds of silk simultaneously. So we see here's a black widow spider, and the silk from the spiders, instead of coming out of the mouth parts, it comes out of specialized abdominal glands. So all of the silk machinery for the spider is in the abdomen, this back part right here. So if you were to magnify the very posterior end of the spider, you would see that it has these tiny modified legs, which are called spinnerets. And on the spinnerets, if you magnify them even further, they are arrayed with hundreds of little spigots. Okay, so each one of these things is a spigot. It's a little nozzle from which the fiber emerges. Okay, and literally there are hundreds of these on the back end of the spider. Okay, so spider silk has attracted an enormous amount of attention because it has very superior mechanical properties. So that's one of the things, another thing that spider silk is famous for. So I'm going to sort of take you through this graph. And so this graph is basically showing stress-strain curves for a number of different kinds of engineering and biological materials. So for example, we can see here, this is the y-axis, which shows breaking stress. And the maximum value on the y-axis here basically is an indication of the strength, the tensile strength of a material. The x-axis here is strain, and another way you can think of strain is stretchiness or extensibility. So the further you are out on this strain axis, the stretchier the material. So we have things like steel and Kevlar up here, which have extremely high tensile strength, okay? But they're not very stretchy. So what that means is that they also don't have high toughness, okay? So one other thing I want to define is this word tough. So toughness is defined as the area under each one of these curves. So we can see the area under steel and Kevlar, it's actually quite small. But we can compare that to something like this. This is called spider capture silk. And it doesn't have this high tensile strength that steel and Kevlar does, but because it has this extreme stretchiness, the area under the curve is very large, and therefore it's extremely tough. So toughness is the ability of a material to absorb energy before it breaks. And again, we can see things like steel and Kevlar. Here's cotton. Here's Bombyx silk, that's the commercial silk. Here's nylon. Now what's remarkable about spider silk is not only is it extremely tough, but spiders make different kinds of silks that are mechanically remarkable in different ways. So first, I want to show you this red curve here. This is called spider dragline silk. And this is the kind of silk that an orb weaving spider would use to make its web. but just the radii and the frame of the web. So that is one kind of silk fiber that the spider makes and uses in this web. So we can see that it has high tensile strength, and it's not super stretchy, but it's stretchy enough so that it has high toughness. Now, this blue thing here, that's called capture spiral silk. So that's another kind of silk fiber that the spider uses to make this web. And that kind of material, it doesn't have the high tensile strength over here, but as I told you, it has extreme stretchiness. So again, it's remarkably tough. So again, just keep in mind, it's making these two very different kinds of materials simultaneously, and both are incorporated into this web structure. Okay, so a little bit more about spiders. They're a huge group of animals. There's over 40,000 described species in the world, and many more certainly exist. So I'm just showing you here a smattering of diversity, and we actually brought a couple of examples today. So this is a tarantula here, which is a very large spider. And then we have a couple of black widows here. These are completely safe, okay? So later you can come and look at these guys. And these guys make very different kinds of silks as well, okay? So spiders, they're diverse in terms of their ecology and behavior, but one thing that unites all of them is that they all have the capacity to make silk. It's a defining feature of being a spider. So as I told you, it's made by these abdominal organs, and they use it for many different functions. So we already talked about how it's used in webs for prey capture, but it's also essential for reproduction. So I'm sure many of you have seen spider egg cases that females make. Male spiders also make what's called a sperm web, and it's essential for them to make a sperm web in order for them to transfer their sperm to the female. So spiders would not exist without silk. And they also make this thing called the drag line, which, as I told you, is used in that orb web. So this is basically like a lifeline that allows them to avert catastrophic falls. And then we've got a retreat here, and then it's also important for dispersal. Okay, and so even within, if you consider all of these things one sort of category, we have, even within one of those categories, just tremendous variation when we look at different species. So as we know, many spiders make webs, but there's actually lots of different kinds of webs out in nature, and it depends on the species. Different species make different webs. So we can see examples here of sheet webs. Here's an orb web. Here's an orb sector. Here's an orb that's been transformed into a ladder that's specialized for moths. Then here we have what's called the bolus spider. Bolus spider makes a kind of thread-like web. It's just one thread and has this drop of glue up at the bottom. And what it does is it spins this thing around when a moth comes nearby. It also attracts moths through pheromones that it makes that mimic the moth pheromones. So it spins this thing around, the moth comes in and it hits it and it eats it. And then we've got this ogre face spider over here, and that makes this kind of little small orb web that it just holds, and it waits for an insect to walk nearby, and then it just throws it over the insect and grabs it and pulls it up. So there's all kinds of amazing diversity in web structures used by spiders. Okay, so how is it that they make all these different kinds of silks? So I told you the glands that produce the silk, they're in the abdomen, and the abdomen is usually filled with these silk glands. So here's the insides of an orb weaving spider. So that's the spider that makes that classical, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry about that. Can't be perfect. So anyway, so the orb weaving spider makes that classical wheel-shaped orb web, and inside the abdomen of that spider, it has 7 different kinds of silk glands. So this picture is basically showing them all color-coded, the different gland types. And I just kind of want to walk you through some of them so you know what they are. So down here we have in dark blue, this is called the major ampulate gland, and that's the gland that makes the silk that turns into that dragline silk. Okay, it's that same silk that makes up the frame and radii of the orb web. Okay, so over here in turquoise, we have what's called the flagelliform silk. And that's the silk that the spider uses. So the silk that's made by this gland, it comes out of special spigots out here, flagelliform spigots. And those fibers are used to make that capture spiral, that really stretchy material. Over here, we have the tubuliform glands in yellow. So those go out to spigots that are the tubuliform spigots, and they make a silk that's exclusively used by females to make the egg case. And I'm not going to go through all of these because of time, but I just want to point out another one that's cool, which is piriform glands. Piriform glands, they're small and numerous, and they have spigots that they go to. That kind of silk material is used to, it's used as cement. So basically, when the web is being built, it's held up by this frame, which is usually attached to things like a substrate or including some vegetation, and it has to cement the frame to something. So the cement is the piriform silk material. Okay, so next I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the silk is made up of. Now, spider silk, as well as insect silk, is pretty much made up of proteins. And what I'm showing you here is, again, the silk gland anatomy of an orb-weaving spider. So these are all different kinds of glands. And these graphs, don't worry too much about them, but basically what they're showing is the composition of the glands in terms of the different amino acids that are in them. Okay, so amino acids make up proteins. And we see, if we look at the different glands, which are the different graphs corresponding to the different glands, that they have different amino acid compositions. So what that means is that there are different silk proteins that are being made by each of the glands, okay? And it's the properties of those silk proteins which determine the mechanical properties of the fibers that they compose. All right, so I don't want to labor over this too much, but again, one of the really fascinating things about the spider silks is the proteins that they're made up of, and they're extremely long proteins. So all you need to think about now is that compared to most proteins overall, the sequences, they're extremely long. And the silk fibers are made up of stacks and stacks and stacks of these proteins. So I just want to briefly mention, this is the kind of work that I do in my laboratory, is characterizing the genes that encode these different kinds of silk proteins. So we have certain kind of silk proteins that make up the dragline fibers. We have certain kinds of silk proteins that make up the egg case fibers. So that's a lot of interest, is just trying to determine what the actual proteins are and the genes that make up those proteins. Okay, so one of the reasons why we want to know what those genes are is because spider silk has a lot of desirable properties. And there's a lot of interest in trying to mimic those properties using genetic engineering. So again, just to review, one of the great things about spider silk is it has this extreme toughness or ability to absorb energy, and it exceeds the toughness of things like steel and Kevlar. And importantly, it's very lightweight. So if you had the same mass of silk, spider silk, as you did of steel, it would actually be 5 times stronger. And extensibility, I already mentioned that. And then it can withstand extreme temperatures, so very broad temperature ranges without degradation. And then also, it can be controlled, its degradation can be controlled within the body, and it also has biocompatibility. Okay, so basically, if we know what those genes are that encode the silk proteins that make up those fibers, it is then possible to introduce those genes into other organisms which could make large quantities of the silk protein. And the reason why that's a big interest is because it's not really easy to farm spiders. They're very aggressive. So there's been work done to introduce spider silk genes into goats, and then they produce silk proteins in their milk. And I'm going to talk about this briefly at the end, how people have also introduced spider silk genes into silkworms that normally produce commercial silk. And there's a lot of work going on introducing spider silk genes into crop plants because they're much easier to harvest and deal with than things like goats, which are complicated and expensive. So the idea is that if you could produce large quantities of spider silk protein, then you can make things. So there's been a lot of interest by the military for ballistic purposes and things like making bulletproof body armor or improved body armor that's now normally made of Kevlar. Potentially you could make it out of some kind of composite, Kevlar, spider silk. There's a lot of interest in the biomedical field. using spider silk to create artificial tendons, ligaments, corneas, all kinds of things, and so on. All kinds of high performance materials. Okay, so now I want to introduce this really neat thing that came about just a few years ago. There's been a lot of curiosity about whether you could actually farm spiders in the same way that we do silkworms to produce commercial silks. And in fact, there is some kind of historical precedence for this. So apparently there was a French monk who was in Madagascar, and through his efforts there, he tried to, and actually successfully managed to get the local people there to produce a silk textile that was made purely from spider silk. And this drawing was recovered from that time. The silk textiles that were made by Kamue, the monk, and the Malagasy people, this is again in Madagascar, that worked on it, they were exhibited in France, but there's no actual remaining textile. So sort of the knowledge to produce this didn't exist anymore, or it had been lost to time. And in fact, there are two very ingenious people who were inspired by this story and wanted to see if they could essentially do this themselves. So two individuals, one's a textile historian and the other was a designer, or is a designer. They started a business, a sort of business in Madagascar, where they took these same species that were previously used, which is the golden orb weaver, and the silk that it produces has a slight golden hue, which isn't really apparent when you see its webs, but when you have lots and lots of it together, it's really, really yellow. So again, inspired by that drawing, they created little apparatuses to, you've got your spider here, and here's actually the spinnerets, a little bit hard to tell, and they have lots and lots and lots of these spiders all going, and local people basically milling these spiders, the silk from these spiders. So you can see here, it's a little bit hard to tell, but what's going on here, we have lots of different threads that are emanating here, which are actually, they're all each coming from a spider, okay? And then they're sort of put together, and then they're spooled up on reels like this. So you can see that's the natural color of the silk, is this golden hue. And here they're actually putting together the fibers in a loom to weave a textile. So these are those two guys I was telling you about right there. And here is the first thing that they created. So they're using a sort of traditional loom and traditional Malagasy sort of weaving techniques to create this thing. But again, you can see we have the whole thing is completely made of this species silk. And the second thing that they made was this amazing cape. And so they produced the textile fabric itself, and then subsequently these little spiders were embroidered on top of it with the same silk material. So it's a pretty amazing thing that they did. Okay, so now I want to talk more about the familiar commercial silk and the biological aspects of its production. So as I mentioned, it comes from a larvae, okay? And we call it a worm, right? But the worm is this larvae of a moth, okay? So this is the adult stage, and this larvae uses silk to build a pupal case, which is an enclosure that it hangs out in for a period of time until it develops into the adult. So the interesting thing, I mean, there's many fascinating things about this story, but this is one of 2 or 3 examples of a domesticated insect. Okay, so we know about domesticated dogs, we know about cows, various plant crops and things like that. It's very difficult to domesticate an insect. And silk moths, in this particular species, Bombyx mori, this is one example of a domesticated insect. So another example we know about are honeybees. And because of their long association with humans, they have been highly transformed through artificial selection. So these guys can't actually fly. Their wild ancestors could fly, but they have been selectively bred so that you have adults that have the smallest wings. And over time, those wings have become extremely reduced and they cannot fly anymore. And in fact, in order for these guys to reproduce at all, human beings have to move them together. And if there was no human intervention in their life cycle, they would go extinct immediately. Okay, so here's a little bit more about the life cycle. The whole thing takes place in about 2 months. So they start off as a tiny egg, they hatch out, and they eat mulberry leaves. That's the food that they eat. And they grow into this larval stage. They're a larval stage as soon as they hatch out of the egg, and they start off small and they grow bigger and bigger and bigger into this larval stage. And then after a period of time, then they create the pupal case around them. Okay? So the pupae is inside of this case, and this is the thing that we turn into commercial silk. And then if the life cycle is allowed to be completed, what they do is they chew their way out of the cocoon. Okay, so they come out of the cocoon, and then human beings, again, have to put them together in order for them to mate and for the females to produce eggs. Okay, so if you take one of those larvae and you peel off their skin, what you would see is this. Okay, so this is the guts of a silkworm. And the important thing to focus on is all of this stuff on the side, all of this stuff over here. Those are the paired silk glands. They occupy a huge amount of the body because they have to produce such a huge amount of silk. And the silk glands have different parts to them. So basically, they go like this, and they turn into this big long tube, which ends. Now this big long tube here that's all folded up on itself is the secretory portion. That's the part where the silk proteins are being secreted. And then they move up into this storage area, which is larger. So the liquid silk proteins are being stored there. And then they're pushed through a very narrow duct. And the duct emerges externally as a spigot. Okay, so they have 2 spigots on either side of their mouths, and that's where the silk fibers come out of. Okay, so that gives you a sense of where the silk itself is coming from. Okay, so in a sense, the silkworm silk molecularly is very similar to the spider silk. Essentially, it's composed of proteins, and they have similar structures. At the sort of the scale of molecules, what you have is a lot of what are called beta sheets, which is a whole bunch of molecules that are stacked together very tightly and held together with hydrogen bonds. And having this large number of hydrogen bonds in a very small space confers high tensile strength to the material and also toughness. So this is also sort of a microscopic image of the cocoon. So you can see each one of these things over here is a cocoon fiber. Okay, so as I was explaining, the larvae is making a cocoon, and the way in which they do it is they're emitting these 2 fibers, which are actually cemented together with the material called sericin. And then they have this interesting behavior where they sort of do this figure-8 motion back and forth. And then they continue doing this over and over again until they're completely encased in the cocoon. So you can kind of see the figure-8s here. And the really amazing thing about this is the whole cocoon is one continuous strand. Okay, just one continuous strand of silk. It's not broken up into pieces. And this is really essential for the actual processing of the material. So I brought with me today some examples of the Bombyx mori cocoons, but these ones are ones in which the adults have hatched out. So you can see that they have these openings. Okay, so you could think of this as cruelty-free, because usually in the silk production, what happens is that the overwhelming majority of cocoons that are produced on a farm are boiled. Okay, so the adults are not allowed to hatch out. Most of them die that way. However, you have to have some in order to continue the next generation. So that's what this would be an example of. So I'll just pass those around. Okay, so you can see here, this one is cut open, and you can see the pupae inside. It's in its quiescent or resting stage. And you can see this extreme thickness of the cocoon. And this is also something that's been selected for over thousands of years. So a little bit about the cultivation. As I mentioned, they eat mulberry leaves. So a silk farm, usually consists of, it has to be somewhere where you can gather a lot of these mulberry leaves. So there's usually also many of these trees nearby. And basically you've got the larvae stage are just arrayed on tables or trays with tons of these leaves, and they continuously eat. And this practice of rearing silkworms to make silk is called sericulture. Okay, so we can see here, this is an example of a farm in Vietnam, and there's many different sort of cultural practices in different regions that are associated with silk production. So here's an example of some practices that happen in Japan. They have, over here, you've got the worms are actually crawling all over these cardboard racks, and within the racks, they have these sort of little compartments. And the worms, because these behaviors have been selected, actually naturally go into a little compartment and create their cocoon. So it's all very well organized. Okay, so the next thing that happens is, this is the cruel part. So most of the cocoons are boiled in water. Okay, and the purpose of that is to remove the sericin, or the gummy material that keeps the cocoon fibers together. So the fibers start unraveling once they're boiled like this, and we can see this woman, this is in Vietnam. You can take a brush and you can start pulling up a whole bunch of fibers that way, and then they can be reeled up into greater amounts of thickness. Okay, and then of course, once you have fibers, you can make a textile with a loom. So here's just an example of some silk cloth that's been made with silkworm silk. Okay, and then also just AJ, who put this part of the presentation together, wanted everybody to know where silk is being produced today. And most of it is happening in China and India, and with some other countries having some contribution to silk production as well. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of silk production. And really, I can't do the subject, I can't do a good job with this in the time that I have, because it's actually a very, very complicated and long history. So I'm going to focus on a few highlights that I think are interesting and relevant for us, at least for us in the class, and being here in Lowell in Massachusetts. So what we know about silk, so I've already told you that it comes from Bombyx mori, which is that cultured silk. It turns out there's been a few other examples of moths that have been cultivated for their silk. They're in a different group of moths, and they're very showy, but really it's at a very small amount compared to Bombyx mori. So this just sort of gives you an overview of the events I'm going to highlight, and we're going to start back in 2450 BC. So we're talking about 4,000 years ago, is where there's the first evidence of some kind of human cultivated silk fibers. So the earliest evidence that's known of silk threads goes back to 2450 BC, which is from some Indus River sites. So that's in the area where Pakistan roughly is today. But the sort of earlier history of silk, I think, is really shrouded in mystery. And there's a lot of mythology associated with it, which may or may not be true. So apparently, there's some information out there suggesting that silk was discovered in the 27th century BC. And I find that really hard to make heads or tails of, because I don't really know if there's any significant recorded history from that time. But anyway, we know most likely that silk production started in China, because that's where there's the most sort of evidence of early silk production, even though there was this association with this Indus River site. And there's examples of early silk textiles from the 4th century BC, from the 2nd century BC that still survive today. And there's this example of a painting of Chinese women doing some kind of ancient preparation of silk. Okay, so massive jump in history. We're going to 139 BC, and this is just to point out that this was the period when this route known as the Silk Road was established. And the purpose of the Silk Road was to bring exotic commodities from China to sort of approximately where Western Europe is. And we see over here these red areas represent the terrestrial or land routes, and then in blue here we have the water routes. And in truth, there were many things that were traded over this road. And in fact, that was really the root of how we got the plague and the Black Death over to Europe, which was devastating for Europe, killed 60% of the population. Many other kinds of things, spices and whatnot, but the name Silk Road is associated with silk because it was so highly desired and difficult to get, because really the production was in China and they were very strict about allowing any of the secrets to get out. Okay, so now we're going to hop again over to relatively modern history. So Stacy, who worked on this part of the presentation, wanted to focus on some of the technological advances that happened predominantly in Europe and especially France. So one of the things that was really important for the development of silk textiles was the jacquard loom. And the jacquard loom was also very interesting to her because it was an early form of the computer. So the idea here is that it sort of allowed a mass production of textiles which had complex patterns on them. And the patterns would be determined by these punch cards which fed into the machine, and they'd be in different patterns and would determine basically control the machine in terms of which kinds of threads are used at which times. And so here's an example of a modern jacquard loom, and here are the punch cards over here. And these, so obviously these are still used more or less today. And then another thing she was really interested in was this association between Louis Pasteur and the silk industry. So in France, there was a serious problem for the silk industry. So that was one of the European centers of silk industry in modern times, because of this problem called Pembrin disease. So it was a kind of disease that was caused by a microspore, which was picked up on the mulberry leaves. And a microspore, it's just this certain kind of microscopic protist, a very small organism. And it causes disease which prevented the silkworms from producing silk. So it was a big problem for that industry, and Louis Pasteur was recruited to try and solve the problem. And he spent a lot of time doing sort of early microscopic examinations of the worms, and basically determined that it was caused by this microspore. And this contributed to his overall understanding or development of this idea that many diseases are caused by microorganisms, which is what we today know as the germ theory, which was a huge advance in modern medicine. Okay, so now we're going to skip ahead to a local angle, which I hope will be of interest to you. So we were sort of interested in fleshing out any kind of interesting examples we could find of silk production that happened in Massachusetts. And in fact, there was quite a lot of history that we could unearth. So it turns out that when Massachusetts was founded, there was a lot of interest in developing silk production here at the time. And so many mulberry trees were planted and eggs were brought over in the hope that we could establish, there could be an established silk production. So this was introduced first in Virginia, and that didn't work. And there was an introduction of silk production in Massachusetts, in the area which is in Florence, Massachusetts, which is basically, it's like a suburb today of Northampton. And in this area, there was an early, very interesting history, but there was a kind of community that developed in Florence in the very early part of the 19th century that was this sort of utopian abolitionist community, and they did different things like they had different kinds of farms, and one of the kind of farms that they had was a silkworm farm. And then this eventually transformed into this business called the Nonotuck Silk Company, and that was eventually transformed into the Corticelli Silk Company. And so this is an image from a book that I had printed, which I brought with me today, and I'll just pass around that here, of the Corticelli silk mill. So they had very extensive milling process there, but what was really interesting about what they did, which was very unusual for North America, was that they did the entire process from silkworm to cloth. So most of the silk production that ever happened in the US was using silk that was imported from other countries. But here they actually were successful in farming the silkworms and producing the silk themselves and then turning into a variety of different products. So this was established in 1838 and went all the way till 1930, not too long ago. And here's just some images, other images from the book. Here's some skeins of silk that they would package into these books. And they also sold various products like these cocoons for educational purposes. And this is an example of one of their advertisements. And this cat here, or different cat images, was sort of an iconic image associated with their advertisements. And in fact, I've read that there was, around the 1910s, there was a very large neon sign that was over Times Square that was of one of these Corticelli silk cats. So that's pretty interesting. Here's a few more examples of products that they made and sold. So they had crochet and knitting silk, and they had many different kinds of silk thread products that they sold. And here's some different colors. They also did dyeing of the silk into different colors. So with that, we're going to just briefly mention the limited history that's associated with Lowell, but still very interesting. There was a Lowell silk mill, and probably many of you recognize this because this is one of the park buildings, I believe, on Market Street. So this silk mill was established in 1923, and unlike the Corticelli silk company that I just described, what happened here was that they received silk fibers and wove it into textiles. Okay, and these were like fancy things that would line coffins, which is kind of depressing thought, or other sort of high quality type fabrics. And this mill was a subsidiary of another company called the Newmarket Company, which was located in southern New Hampshire. And I believe that the mill closed in about 1954. I think that was when it closed. Yes, 1954. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention is some of the future aspects of silk production. Now, I talked a little bit about some futuristic things happening with spider silk. There's a lot of futuristic things happening with moth silk as well. One of the really interesting things people are doing is trying to figure out what you can do with solubilized cocoon silk. So the idea with solubilized cocoon silk is you sort of reverse engineer the process. You take the cocoon fibers and then you boil them until they're in solution. So it's a clear solution, and then you can do a whole bunch of different things with them. So one thing you can do is you can pour it onto a flat surface and make a film. And a remarkable thing about the silk when it's turned into films is that it has an extreme clarity to it. And they can do things like nano indentation, so printing onto the silk film various kinds of things. So they can embed different information, they can create holograms, they can do something like this where you have a gold sensor that's been embedded into this thin silk film, and that could be used as a food sensor to detect whether food has gone bad or vaccines have gone bad through detecting microorganisms or something like that. Here's an example of a silk film, and the film is actually down here, and the light's being projected through it to show over here a hologram. Okay, so this image here is being projected through this silk film. And it can be used with different molding techniques. So this is an example of a really, it's not to scale, but this is so kind of artery type thing that you could manufacture potentially. And the last thing we wanted to mention was how all of this stuff can be brought together. So we talked about how spider silk is remarkably tough, and for that reason very desirable. But the problem with spider silk is it's very difficult to produce it in mass quantities naturally, because spiders are aggressive and they eat each other, and they're not domesticated like our good friend the silkworm. So one of the things that scientists have recently had pretty good success with is inserting spider silk genes into the genome of Bombyx mori, or the silkworm. And what I'm showing you here is how they've genetically engineered it such that the spider silk gene is also attached to a gene that encodes a protein for green fluorescence protein. And so it's kind of what they call a reporter gene, which means that if you shine a light that allows for fluorescence glow, it will indicate whether the spider gene has actually been properly inserted. So we can see here, these are some Bombyx mori cocoons, and on here, that's native Bombyx mori, the normal kind. And over here, even under regular light, it has a kind of glow to it. But if you put it under fluorescence light, you can see that the fibers from the cocoon actually fluoresce, and that indicates that the spider silk protein has been incorporated. And here's the glands. Those are the glands I showed you on the outside, or the inside rather, from Bombyx mori. And again, it has this green fluorescence glow indicating it's filled with spider silk protein. And over here, we're showing you the stress strain curves indicating over here in red, that's the native spider dragline silk, which has the really great toughness. Down here is that of Bombyx mori, which is not as good. And these three lines or curves represent various examples of fibers that have been collected from silkworms that have been genetically engineered. So we can see that it's now producing silk that's not quite as good as spider silk, but it's sort of approaching it in terms of toughness, and it's certainly improved over Bombyx mori. So the idea is that now once they're doing this, we can easily harvest large quantities of silk of high performance, because we know now that we've got this long history of cultivation of Bombyx mori, or silkworm. Okay, so that's pretty much what the presentation was, and I hope I didn't keep you too long.